Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
Welcome, Mark, to the Beyond Belief podcast. And I appreciate you reaching out to be part of the show. And I think you've got a pretty interesting background. I don't think I've interviewed anybody Catholic before. So just that alone, I think will be an interesting glimpse. And then you are also a social worker in the mental health space. And so your take on religion as well, I think will be very much appreciated here. But let's start right at the beginning with what denomination you were raised in and what that was like.
Sure. So I was born into a Catholic family, or what's known as a cradle-Catholic, someone who was, raised from birth in the Catholic Church. My father's family is of Irish descent. My mother's family is of French-Canadian descent. Most Irish folks, migrated to the U.S. in the late 80s, 1880s. They brought their Catholicism with them. My mother and her family, coming from Montreal, also very Catholic background. Interestingly enough, my father, somewhere in his family, they skipped a generation because he wasn't Catholic when he met my mother, but he converted in order to get married to her. I just brought up in a very, traditional Roman Catholic upbringing. Interestingly, one of the transitions, if you're familiar with this at all, if you ever heard of Vatican II, in the mid to late 60s in the Catholic Church is when it started actually trying to modernize itself. So I was born right around that time. So I experienced the kind of the blending of the old and the kicking and screaming into the new. So, from a religious perspective, that's where my starting point is.
Very interesting. So I have so many questions again, because I haven't really been able to talk to someone Catholic before in this capacity. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is, what was the difference between Catholicism and other forms of Christianity? I know this is a very basic question, but are there like some big distinctions between, I don't know, someone who was Protestant or I'm aware of the fact broadly that Catholicism is not the mainstream religion of the United States, for example, right? And so were there some distinctions there between how you were raised and how maybe another American Christian typically might have been raised?
I'm sure there are a lot of variations on a theme for, most people that grow up Catholic or grow up Christian. To answer your question, there's so many different variants of Christianity these days over the past, 2,100 years, so to speak. But for me, my uniqueness was that when I was born in Rhode Island in New England, and being from an Irish Catholic family, and being in New England as a young child, you don't really notice that there's anything else out there than what you're doing. There's a typical of any child, growing up in any culture, any religion, what you are familiar with is your social network, and what it exists of and what it consists of is basically what you see the universe being based upon. Something very pivotal happened in my life when I was 7 years old. We moved from the small town in Rhode Island where everybody I knew was Catholic. Everybody I knew pretty much was a relative, to the Alabama-Florida state line, a very small town in the Deep South in Alabama, where being Yankee, Northerner, being a Catholic, they were, very suspicious and you were suspect. So I did, and even just having an accent you sting about, So it's like, you really don't know what you don't know until you are presented with something different. So that was a really culture class for me. And that was the first indication that I realized that other people have other beliefs. They have other lifestyles, other expressions of spirituality and religion. That was my first encounter really with the Protestant religions. Well, and, being a small southern town, there was a lot of, there's a church on every corner, So it's the First Baptist Church, the Second Baptist Church, the Pentecostal Church, the Adventist Church, everything imaginable. And as a young child still, I'm trying to figure out who my peer group was. There were very few. There were any other Northerners I knew of. There were any other Irish people, or Irish descent, nobody else had my accent. Nobody else, there were very few. I had two classmates in the school that I went to that, attended the same church I did, who were Catholic. Also going on at this time, this is in the very early 70s, this is when segregation is being challenged by civil rights and everything, and integration is being forced upon the southern states. Talking about kicking and screaming, being this kind of northerner living in the South during this time, it was an interest. It was hard to make sense of a lot of different things that were going on around me culturally, in being in the South, being Catholic, all these sorts of things. So the interesting thing outcome of that was, for me, being someone who's naturally introverted, I dove deeper into Catholicism because it was an identity piece that kind of provided me some foothold, and to some extent, even though as an introvert, I don't like being in the spotlight, but it was nice being different. It was nice being, oh, he's a Yankee or he's a Catholic or whatever, It's like, they didn't say that about many other people. And it's usually an insult, but at the same time, it was nice, to have something that made you unique, so to speak.
Yeah, I've noticed that pattern. We can talk more about the psychology of it, but on two levels, Jews, and this may be a narrative I've heard that exists for other minorities too, have created a narrative, an identity around being persecuted. Because if you're going to be hated, you may as well be the most hated. And then that actually that's what makes you special. You're the most hated. And I did this on a very personal level growing up. I felt very different from the people around me. And I really leaned into that identity of the most persecuted, the most different, the most misunderstood. And I find it fascinating that even negativity can be a solace for people, can be a consolation. It can be a place where you go to. It doesn't have to be escape to good places. You can escape to bad places. And I find that a fascinating aspect of human nature.
It's very similar to what we call the familiarity bias. You may have heard this in mental health circles where, why is it so hard for people to leave negative patterns behind? Well, the reason is because they feel safer and secure in something that's predictable and that they understand. Some of the worst examples of this you hear is when people say, why, if somebody's in an abusive relationship, why don't they leave? I mean, over time, because we have survival instincts, even when we find ourselves, in adverse circumstances, if we can find ways of having a modus of control in those circumstances, it provides us some sense of solace. And that kind of blurs our vision to some escape routes that might exist to us. But even when somebody introduced this to us, this may not be working for you as well as you think it is. You might want to try something different. They trust you because it's unfamiliar. I don't know if that, speaks to what you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I think Freud called it the repetition compulsion, right? Where you feel the need to come back to what is familiar, regardless of whether it's good for you, because the familiarity is still safer than the unknown. And we have this really baseline aspect of that.
Yeah. I mean, the other aspect of that too is if you think of it just from a basic, human perspective, we're social animals and we seek a group. And part of the reason we seek that group is one, for acceptance, but also for validation. It's all about identity. Like I was saying a minute ago, it's like, if I took a deeper dive into being Catholic and being a Northerner in the midst of, the segregated Souths fighting for integration, for me, it provided some validation for who I was and my identity. And until you recognize that's no longer beneficial to you or what your outlook or goals are, you don't really have a lot of reason to change it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, just some more background for, were you like a classic large Catholic family with lots of siblings?
There are 4 children, so moderate. But I mean, in our small town, we were probably one of the more Catholic families. My dad was the head usher, mother sang in the choir. I was an altar boy. and ended up becoming the choir director over time because of my interest in music. And, so we were always there, always involved. The Catholic church that I went to, although it was small, it had, a regular bazaar. I think it was a fall bazaar where we'd have a cookout and all these, vendor booths. So people from all around town would come to food and to enjoy the activities and things of that nature. One little curious fact is in the United States back in the early 70s, they reinstituted the death penalty. In the town that I lived in, one of its claims to fame is that it had the prison that had a throne in the electric chair. One of the first individuals who actually, unfortunately, was executed when they reinstituted the death penalty in the United States was in that prison. He happened to be Catholic. And our pastor, who was from Ireland, was, his chaplain. So here, just imagine, I don't know if you could picture a Norman Rockwell painting where there's this little bitty Catholic church in the middle of nowhere in this town, surrounded by CBS, NBC, ABC, trucks and towers and everything at the church, all because this person who up the road in the prison is being executed happens to be Catholic. So it's like, wow, not the kind of attention that you want to get, but it's, just a strange set of circumstances. So anyways, you stand out like a sore thumb, you either embrace it or, you deal with it in other ways.
For sure. What did Catholicism mean to your parents? And I'm hearing a little bit more that it was like from your mother is where it was came from more strongly. What did it represent to her?
It's interesting. Initially, I would say it was more strongly from my mother. She came from a history where she had a number of uncles who were priests and other family members in her extended family who were in religious life. And later in life, my father became a very engaged. I mean, he was active in the church, like I said, as the head usher and all that kind of stuff. But later he had this kind of spiritual awakening and even embraced his Catholic faith even more. This was after I was in the seminary studying for the priesthood myself. But yeah, I think, it was a very Catholic household. There was a prayer before every meal. I'll give you this little tidbit. I remember the pastor coming over to have a conversation with my mother one day. And afterwards, I don't know if she told me this directly or if I overheard it, but he was upset with her because more Christians from the parish were coming to tell their problems to her than they were to him in the confessional. So if that gives you any indication of the involvement of my parents in the church life. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so was it working for you? Like, because that arc of you eventually studying to become a Catholic priest yourself, does that mean that overall you felt in alignment with this Catholic way of life?
But I think there's two things that probably connected for me. One is, like I said, I'm pretty introverted by nature, so I'm a deep dive individual. The way I look at human behavior in general on a social spectrum is the idea of the bell curve, which most people are familiar with, so they can connect with this idea. You have this big swath in the middle that contains the majority of any situation or any group of people, and you have the polar opposites on either end. And in religion, what I find is that most people, like I was saying earlier, you don't know what you don't know. You're exposed to these things. It's normative for you. And you just accept it for what it is. You don't think twice about it. At some point in your life, some challenges come up, and some people will start to navigate towards one pole or the other. There are those who become the fundamentalists and the extremists, and they choose, either words or weapons, apologists, or whatever attack methodology they want, because they can't take dissonance. They can't take anyone questioning, any cracks in their philosophy or theology. On the other hand, you have the folks like myself who are like, well, what does it really mean? Is it true? Because for me, personally for me, but also for other people who fall to that end of the spectrum, they're like, I want to be on board with something that I really know is the right thing. So I think part of it for me was, the deep diving going into seminary. And if you're not familiar with this at all, and to prepare for the priesthood, you generally have 4 years of undergraduate study, like anybody else going in to get their undergraduate degree in a Catholic seminary. Then you have a 4-year master's program. And the reason it's 4 years and not 2 is because in addition to all the theological studies that you're doing, you're also doing all the practical application, hands-on training of how to pastor people. So you spend a lot of times in different churches, on different assignments, working with different populations, and learning how to give a homily and sermon, those sorts of things, how to say mass, all these sorts of things. So it's a lengthy process. And for me, I was in there through that entire process, and I took some time off in the middle and actually joined a monastery and spent some time there again, trying to take an even deeper dive, is there a mystical experience? What would that look like? Where do I find this? And it just so happens that where I was doing my undergraduate studies, it was run by a Benedictine monastery. Fell in love with it. Just think as an introvert, monastic life, it's a pretty much a no-brainer, but then once you get on the inside of a monastery, just like once you get on the inside of any group, you recognize that problems exist there. Human nature doesn't, there's a saying, it might be a title of one of John Kabat-Zinn's books called Wherever You Go, There You Are. This idea, you can't escape yourself. And you can deal with yourself, you can improve yourself, but you can't escape yourself. Even if you change who you are from your past negative behaviors, embracing that past is a part of the growth process. So, in a nutshell, that's how I got to where I was in the whole spectrum of studying for the priesthood, and how I kind of launched by having this kind of solid background in my family and taking a deeper and deeper dive, to try and figure out, well, what's the reality here? One of the things that was crucial to me was that when, I was in the seminary, I had just a chance encounter with a Monsignor. A Monsignor is, if you're not familiar, is an honorary title given to a priest who's been long in service. It's kind of like the gold watch, So, this is somebody who's been around a long time, very established, probably built some churches, what have you. But it's just a kind of a title of honor. But when he was told that I was getting ready to go into graduate studies, the last 4 years of preparation for the priesthood, he just looked at me and he was half joking but half serious, and he said, "Don't learn too much." And I thought, that doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like I don't want to know it all. Like if I was a cardiothoracic surgeon, it's like, I had the opportunity to speak for 5 minutes in the elevator with one of the most world-renowned cardiothoracic surgeons. He wouldn't say, "Don't learn too much." He's like, "Know it all. Know everything. Be the smartest person in the room. Don't make a mistake." But this was just the opposite. Like, why wouldn't I want to learn too much? Which, kind of like going back to your film in the Deep South as the Yankee Catholic. I'm like, okay, well, let's see what's out there that I shouldn't be learning, I'm kind of a nonconformist to begin with, but I really think that an interesting, just offhanded remark that said, well, let me figure out what's going on here. And so, it just kind of pushes you forward to find out even more, to figure out if what you're going to spend the rest of your life doing is something that you can stand behind. It's just a product that I can study for the next 30 to 40 years in professions as a priest, that I could, stand behind and to continue doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that sort of a natural, I associate those introspection going along well with introversion. And from a very young age, sort of being curious and wanting to understand, and then actually being exposed to, well, there's other things out there. So now I need to figure out, what does this actually mean? And can I get fully behind it? And that means diving as deep as I can into the education, taking all that I have been raised on, caring deeply about doing it the best possible way, and actually deepening my education around it. And that's kind of like the snapshot in your early 20s of trying to do it in the best way possible, as educated as possible. But then there's these little clues of like, well, other parts of society aren't doing this way. I'm being encouraged sometimes to not ask too many questions. And that's kind of like a little bit of like a foreshadowing, if you will, in a way. In the course of all of this, were there any things that I'm assuming for the most part, it really meant a lot to you to be Catholic in childhood, teenagehood, that kind of thing. Were there things that you did struggle with or that you kind of like didn't make sense to you already at that age? And it doesn't have to be that there was, but I'm curious if there was anything like that.
I would say for me personally, it was, just authority and obedience. I've, in addition to being raised in this pretty solid Catholic upbringing, my parents were also very, look, you be who you need to be in this world. When the time comes for you to launch on your own, do what you need to do.
So to summarize, you're saying that there's this tendency, even from a young age, to your parents did encourage you to sort of question. And so there's this story where the bishop comes to confirm you and you're like, no, I don't need a special name. I'm just going to go with the name of Mark, which is one of the, was it apostles? No, that's
One of them writing the gospel.
Well, the gospel, yeah.
Gospels in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a special name already. I didn't need another special name. My name wasn't, Sylvester or some, Regis or what, I don't know. But, it's like I already had a good name for a Catholic name. And it's like, I don't need a second one. So where are you convinced me? Tell me why.
And you're able to push back on authority and ask,
yeah,
exactly. You could already say like, I'm not going to do it because you said so. Give me a good reason, and yet you're still convinced that overall this thing makes sense, and so you're going to pursue as deeply as you can the knowledge around this. So I guess we can then jump back towards your time in seminary, or you're in that gap between undergrad and grad, and you're doing that immersion. And I guess one question I was going to ask just more technically is: a Benedict monk different than a Catholic monk? Is it a subcategory?
Yeah, so in the Catholic Church, this is one of the things that actually was probably the next crack in the whole thing is when you start studying history of your religion, you start to notice things. In the Catholic Church, there's all sorts of religious orders. Some of those are monastic orders, and there's all sorts of different monastic orders. They all have the charism of the person who started them. So the charism of St. Benedict, or Dominicans follow the charisms of St. Dominic or St. Francis. So and that's another interesting little anecdote is that, when you start to think about it, all religions start out as a spiritual journey of a single person. And somehow they morph into this gathering and then this kind of dogmatic compilation of their thoughts or sayings or experiences or directions or whatever. And then you have all of these canons and everything of belief to pass on to further generation. But, basically it all comes back down to this notion of, one person's spiritual expression. So when you get there, when you arrive at that point and you start to think about this historically, the used to be a question about Benedictines, is like, there's so many things to choose from, even in the Catholic Church. Well, what's outside of that? And so once I started getting a taste for the history of this church that I was going to work for, I mean, when you become a Catholic priest, from a professional standpoint, if you're any good at it, if you have a vocation for it, it's a lifelong commitment with great health care, retirement benefits, guaranteed days off a week, not on Sunday, But, it's this notion where it's a package deal. So when you start looking at those things and you realize I've got a really good, future plan here, however, I'm finding cracks. And then you start to wonder, like, well, can I actually be the person who's going to stand up front of all these people on Sunday, and I'm going to create, sermon that are going to help them get through the next, 6 days until they get back to church again and all this sort of stuff. And you start thinking, what happens when they start asking the hard question? And this is where you see the people who are on the other side of the bell curve. These are the ones like, you don't let them ask the questions. You distract them, or you tell them they shouldn't ask those questions, or you use the theology in that the discussion, ongoing debate for centuries between theology and science. For religion and science is the God of the gaps. You can't explain something, so that must be evidence of the divine. For the scientists, it's like, no, we haven't gotten the right question asked and the right experiment and hypothesis put together to determine if it's true or not true. That doesn't mean that it exists because we hadn't gotten there yet. So when you get in a situation, you start wondering, do I want to be the person who has to just kind of put them off or tell them not to think about it? And that, as I was starting to explore those things to find out, can I actually answer some of these things? And I couldn't. Then you start to see some of the unsavory aspects. All religions have, the ugly underbelly, as you might call it, in their history. But some things are just really just glaring. Like, for instance, one of the things is, it was in the, 1500s when Copernicus discovered that, actually it's the earth that revolves around the sun, not the other way around. Well, a lot happened over the next several hundred years in the Catholic Church to say, no, we can't say that. We can't teach that because the Bible says that the earth stood still. So if the earth stands still, everything must be going around her. Geocentric, and heliocentric. It's not until like the 1820s when the church says, okay, you can teach that now. It's not until like 1992 when the church says, yeah, this is correct. It is a heliocentric solar system. And it's not until like the year 2000 when they say, we're sorry. Yeah. So it's like, it's a lot to bear to say that, yeah, I could tell you all these good things. And then there's other things, it's just unfortunate that they happened. That just is eroding.
So accepting the complete package of what it means to be Catholic or religious with the whole set of stuff, with all of the weight of all the negative side that comes with. I'm still wrapping my head around the fact that they acknowledge that the sun revolves, or the earth revolves around the sun in 1992. Right? It's amazing.
Well, they allowed it to be taught in the 1820s.
But it wasn't the formal doctrine.
And they said, yes, this is actually true in 1992 with a papal decree. And then a few years after that, they said, we're sorry for the people that we told it wasn't, and that we may have killed in the process by burning them possibly. Or if they were president, whatever. Yeah. So, I mean, you can see fighting among different Buddhist traditions these days. I mean, literal fighting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this idea. It's a paradox. Human beings, human animals, we want acceptance. We want belonging. We want our group. As soon as we get it, we don't want anybody who doesn't want to be in this group. The same people who are seeking acceptance, but maybe, acceptance for growth. At the same time, they're like, no, this is what we believe. You want to join this group? Fine. You don't want to believe that, or find your own group.
Yeah. And then there's another paradox that I've noticed where once the group gets so big, it's almost the desire for uniqueness parallel to the desire of belonging comes up more. And then you need to you fragment into smaller groups that now have their own sub-identity. It's like almost impossible to have a group of thousands of people who all believe exactly the same thing. They end up sub-fragmenting. And so I noticed this in Judaism, where in the United States, because Jews are a minority, Jewish communities are very often centered around just being Jewish. And your level of observance, for example, doesn't matter that much because at least you're Jewish. And if you send your kids to Jewish school, great, we're happy. You come to the synagogue, we're happy. In Israel, where everybody, a huge majority of the population are Jewish, it's far more fractured actually around these sub-party lines of like, what kind of Jewish are you? And are you Middle Eastern? Are you European? Are you Orthodox? Are you modern? And that actually matters a lot more because you get to be pick and choose, and you still got a lot of people to choose from. And it's almost like we don't want millions of people to be exactly the same. I find that really kind of amusing, right? And I think it speaks exactly to your point. Whereas if this was actually true, couldn't it be more simple? It's like almost just as when you move to a small town in the South and you realize, wait, there's a lot of other stuff going on here outside of my religion completely. But if you also look within the religion, you start to see so many variances, at least in the Jewish tradition and probably in parts of Christianity, where people will be like, oh, if you're that flavor of Christian, you're not even Christian at all. If you're that flavor of Jewish, we don't even count that as being legit. And that just speaks to that point that actually that desire or that statement that only this is true and nothing else is, you can actually encounter that while still being in the religion. You could still see people saying, oh, that flavor of Judaism that you think that you've been raised on, actually, it's completely wrong.
Well, and there's another whole layer that's applied in the United States, and that is based on race. I'm not really sure if you're familiar with the work of Vatican. It's Isabel Wilkerson who wrote the book Caste. And she looks at different caste systems like in India, but she also develops this very well thought out theory about how caste has developed in the United States. And one of the things that she says is that, as immigrants were coming to the U.S., they stopped being, good. They stopped being Scandinavian or Italian. They became white. And in America, in the United States, it's like you're white, or you're not white, or you're indigenous, Native American. They're initially on the broadest strokes. That was the basic breakdown. So he didn't have to stand out as being, German or Irish or what have you. But those things still developed. You go outside of Chicago and you'll find, German neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, all these sorts of things, because it was important to them, to the immigrants, but it was also a benefit to them because, they could just be white Americans.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. One of the biggest transition for me that has been so helpful, what has replaced for me what religion provided as a sense of identity is, I'm just interested in understanding human behavior. And I'm interested in helping people who want to understand how they personally, individually tick as a person. My belief system, if you will, right now is that there's 8 billion people on journeys on this planet right now. You could call it a spiritual journey. Some might even call it a religious journey, but they're just journeys from their time on this planet. And most of us walk through it without taking any time to understand why we're doing and thinking the things we're doing and the things we're thinking. That's the middle of the bell curve. The vast majority of people in any group, religions being one of them, they're comfortable being the cafeteria sort of person. Well, this fits for me. That, I don't really pay attention to that. They might tell me it's important and a part of, what I believe or whatever, but I don't really like it. But I really like this group that I'm with. I feel accepted here. This is my group. That's what human behavior is all about. Social norming and forming is something that is a part of our evolutionary process. If you were to dial this back to the smallest first, as our species was developing, you wouldn't find many groups that were bigger than 50 to 100 people because everybody. Everybody knows everybody. So honesty is not, dishonesty is not an issue because, why would you harm somebody that you rely on every day, that you know and who knows you and who sleeps in the hut next to you? It's only when communities get larger that we start to develop these ideas of we need some omniscient, kind of presence always, like the security cameras on every corner now, that I don't have to watch you anymore because somebody else is.
Yeah.
So you better be good, sort of thing. And that's, it's like sometimes they would break off and go into different ways and found new communities because of resource management. There's not enough resource where they are because they're getting so big. But also one of the ways that they would have this kind of oversight is to create some mythological being or whatever have you, that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, bad things will happen. Even in the, I want to say it's the Creole folklore, maybe the Cajun folk religions, they have this myth of the loup-garou, which is kind of like the werewolf or the boogeyman, that, for children who don't sleep, or if you don't go to sleep at night, don't go outside because, the loup-garou is going to find you and harm you. So this invisible figure or what have you. But it's just human nature. And so that's why when I found your podcast, I thought this is another piece of the puzzle that's been missing, is helping people normalize that, hey, you know what you were doing before was natural. Wanting to shift away from it is just as natural.
Yeah.
It's okay to be an individual. You don't have to assimilate completely into a belief system to be accepted or acceptable, and anything that helps to normalize the process of being on a journey, I think is healthy. And we see more of this now. One of the ways that you could kind of look at this whole idea of how religion kind of has this. One of the questions I was reading in the thing that you set out was this idea of, what don't people get who weren't brought up this way? And I think one of the ways to give an idea of that is if you think of addiction, and if you use alcoholism, the bell curve exists. There can be hereditary and genetic predisposition to developing addictive patterns. You might also have a social component where you're exposed to the home you grew up in. The vast majority of people, at some point in their lives, experiment with alcohol. They consume alcohol in moderation throughout the course of their lives. But on either end of the spectrum, there are those at some point who say, it really doesn't do it for me and I don't need it. They're on the other end of the spectrum, they will drink themselves to death and they don't know why. And it's very similar. Any kind of group that you over-identify with or that you're being constantly pulled back into or threatened if you want to leave or question or what have you, that, the ones who are doing the questioning and the threatening are the ones who are going to drink themselves to death. And the ones who don't get called out in that way are the ones who are with a cafeteria style, like, hey, man, I'm just showing up for the group activities. This is, I feel welcomed here. And I know how loud to be and when not to cross that line. And then the others say, this doesn't make sense. If you're familiar with folks like Richie Dawkins in his work, I mean, his take, being an evolutionary biologist, says, his problem with religion in particular are the truth claims, which any scientist would have. Carl Sagan had the same thing. It's like Carl Sagan's famous for saying something along the lines of, Darwin put this whole system together and realized that he could then say divine intervention or the designer was not necessary in this formula. The formula exists independent of some external force creating it. People like Christopher Hitchens, his take on it is when he says that, all religions are poison is from, his training as an economist and geopolitical observer throughout the world. He's like, you come in and you give these good things to these charitable pieces, but then you try to use these charities to control how people live their lives. And for him, it's like women's reproductive rights and things of that nature. So you recognize that if what you're wanting to do is to give people freedom, then they need to be free to see religion for what it is, which really, in its evolutionary position, it served two purposes. It was a social club that provided acceptance and community, which we seek as human beings. And it was one of the early forms of trying to provide meaning to things we didn't understand. Another aspect of being human is that we're meaning makers. We like to make meaning. And Jordan Peterson, great for making meaning, but it may not be truthful. And that's where you have to get to the point of saying, okay, well, that's a nice myth, but it's a myth. But where does the truth, there's always a nugget of truth in just about everything, because people had good intentions when they asked the questions.
Yeah. I really like the point you said before, you pointing out how it always starts with such an individual, personalized journey. And I think that maps really nicely on this analogy, right? Because if it starts out with an individual's journey, then chances are they're somewhere in the middle of the bell curve and they're going on some sort of, own direction of one or the other. But then you're doing is you're taking what worked for one specific person and you're trying to map it on to an entire society, saying in typical religious fashion, this is what everybody needs to do. All men, all women, like it's very, very broad. And you're going to end up getting a whole groups of people for whom they can't stick to the middle of the bell curve because of temperament, because of their own situations, variety of circumstances. I talk about in Orthodox Judaism, women are supposedly, according to the apologetic explanations, exempt from most commandments because they're taking care of family, taking care of the kids. So God doesn't require them to pray 3 times a day and so on. I found myself at certain times in my past having to step up into the women's role, supposedly, and take care of the children and stuff like that. But at no point was it ever relinquished from me to have to not pray 3 times a day because I wasn't a woman. And so the apologetics definitely didn't make sense, and it did not map onto my life experience. So I think that fits really nicely on the fact that you're taking what worked for one person and then you're extrapolating on it to everybody. I want to make sure that we don't skip part of your own story though, because we were talking about you being in seminary and having questions and kind of seeing the underbelly. And I'm curious, what evolved next out of there on a personal level for you, as far as the next steps you took?
You mean as far as why I didn't continue on to the priesthood, or?
Yeah, I did. Clearly you're not a priest now, right? So what point? What
Never
happened?
was ordained a priest. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I did make my initial vows, we call them simple vows, in the monastery. You make vows, you practice those vows for 3 to 7 years, and then the community votes on you if you want to stay a permanent member. You make your final or solemn vows. I didn't go that far. One of the reasons, when I was in the monastery, a lot of it started making sense to me that, these were all individuals, the monks, with totally different expressions of what it means to be a believer and a follower. Even when you take the large Roman Catholic identity and you drill down, not only to Benedictine, not only to monasticism, but then Benedictine monasticism, drill down. My particular, monastery that I lived in and the culture and flavor there, you still had people that were struggling. It didn't solve the problems. It provided them with maybe a little clarity of more clear, identity, but their identity was, I belong to this group. It didn't matter that it was a religious group. If, they might say that it matters that it's a religious group, that these are my brothers in Christ 100. But the truth was that they were just living out their human expression of being an individual, but needing to live in community. I think one of the most fascinating expressions of Christian monasticism are the Carthusian monks. The Carthusian monks are known to be this very austere monastic group, and it really is a monastery made up of individual hermitages. And each one is a hermit, but that hermit, you might think, well, this is really, this is the pinnacle. These are hermits, but they're supported by non-hermits who are also members of that community that do, the vast majority of the labor running this major complex. And there's a great documentary that was made about 15 years ago, Into Great Silence. And it's a beautiful, this German filmmaker finally got permission to go and do this great documentary in the main slaughterhouse, or the Grand Chartreuse of the Carthusians. And you see all these, brothers that live there bringing the food to the doors of the hermits on a daily basis, so they never starve to death, basically, right? So they rely on each other. They're not really as solitary as one might think. We need other people. We need to find a community.
I'm reminded of the Buddhist kind of agenda of you see, I actually truthfully am Catholic too, right? The whole genre of the top leaders of the highest pinnacle being celibacy, but then the entire religion would die out in one generation if that happened. So you end up with having to grapple with this paradox of we're going to endorse celibacy as the ideal, but we obviously can't have that be the thing that most people do. And that's like a contradiction that I don't think any religion has really resolved. Its relationship around reproduction versus celibacy. Is it really as sinful as you pretend, being as that the only reason you're around now is because of it? So it speaks to that, right? Those are kind of inherent contradictions inside these systems.
Yeah, in Roman Catholicism, there's a really amazing history on the development of celibacy and why it came about in the first place. It was really more of a property rights issue. In the early church, many of the ministers of the church were married. A number of the disciples of Jesus were married. What happens is around the 3rd to 5th century, it's tradition that when you die, your property goes to your children. But if you're, a priest, and the property belongs to who then? To the church or to the family? So they had to remove the element of family. So celibacy takes on a new role. And if you're going to graduate to the level of priesthood, I think in this day was with the bishops, but eventually it just became in fact, that if you were going to be to the ordained ministry, other than in the current Catholic Church, permanent deacons, you could not be married, you'd be celibate. In the Orthodox Church, you can be married and be a member of the clergy up until a point. There's a point where, and I forget exactly where it is, but where you have to determine if you're going to make this next step in your progress in your ministry or ordination or what have you. You have to decide beforehand if you're going to be married or not. Because after you make that distinction, you are going to remain in the state that you're in. Interesting that you mentioned, Buddhism. One of the things that I always, when I came across this piece of information, it's always been so useful to me. In some of the, original speeches of the Buddha, one of the things that he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, is he says, don't take my word for it. Go out and struggle, chew on this thought. When you reach that realization yourself, then it becomes your knowledge. Don't take it because I said it, So I just think there's a lot of value in that. But it goes back to saying this idea of, this is just one person's expression of what their journey is like, and then it gets morphed into something else because, hey, they actually were on something. Something needs to morph into a religion. I don't know if it's helpful, but to the degree it's helpful.
Yeah.
Where are you on that bell curve, so to speak?
Yeah, I love that. I find that a couple things are interesting to me about Buddhism. One is that, yes, that teaching is very useful. I think other religions probably have variations of it. And the question is, how come people still kind of fall for it? Because you have dogmatic Buddhism, right? It doesn't fail to dispel people from falling into that kind of extremism that is very tempting to apart certain demographics of society or to certain social evolution dynamic. And I find that very interesting. I more personally, for example, after being on this bigger podcast, people reaching out to me, I noticed a lot of people asking like, what's your take on such and such? How do you feel about so-and-so like things? And I tell them what I feel, but I try to always remind them, ask everybody you want, but come back to yourself and ask what it makes sense to you. Otherwise, you're turning me into another guru. I don't want to be the founder of yet another religion. So you gotta come back to yourself. Again, I'm curious for you. You said you took the initial vows, but not the final vows. What was the turning point? Was there assuming there was a day where you walked out of there, right? And so curious what that was for you.
Yeah. Well, in a nutshell, the way that happened is the monastery that I joined ran the seminary, the 4-year college that I was initially in. And in that monastery, like in many, there are two groups of monks. There are the monks that teach and work in the seminary, and there are the monks that are there because they want to be monastic. They want to, spend their lives in prayer, reflection, do ordinary work, And I was a good student, and they needed to. They would be more economically sound the more monks who taught in the seminary than having to hire outside professors to come in. So they had a plan for me. They didn't tell me initially, but they were going to send me to get ordained to the priesthood, and then they were going to send me to graduate school in English. I was going to come back and spend the rest of my life teaching in the Quran. I wanted to be a monk. I wanted to clean toilets. I wanted to work in the kitchen. I wanted, whatever. The reason I joined the monastery is not to be a full-time profession, because what I noticed about those two classes of monks, the monks that taught in the seminary, if you went into their cells, their monastic cells, their room, it was like, I remember one, it's like I could be in Greenwich Village in an apartment. Thing is like, you're stepping over stuff. There's like wall-to-wall bookcases and all this kind of stuff. In very busy life. Not that that's bad, but it wasn't what I was looking for in monasticism. I wanted to be, you go into this other group of monks' rooms, and there's a bed, there's a chair, there's one book from the library that they're reading right now. And that's just it, that's what I wanted. And they're like, oh, no, the whole obedience thing again, and authority. We want you to do this because we need you to do that. I'm like, all right, if I'm going to be a busy priest, I can do that out in a church in the diocese, I can do that. So I left, and it was ironically while I was out there looking for a diocese to sponsor me so I could go to graduate school and study for them, that just through circumstance and mutual acquaintances, I met my future wife for now 36 years. And it's like, oh, okay, well, if I'm leaving, because, I already started seeing the cracks and things of that nature. So it wasn't like the deep dive was over. After I left, after we got married, there were still many years of, well, if I can't be a Catholic priest, there are other ministers that are married, and those things. So I looked into Lutheran, Methodist, all that kind of stuff, trying to figure all this out. Then I started studying religions in general, and I started realizing, what religions were all about, and the history of religions, where they come from, and all this sort of stuff. And also at that time, I became exposed to, because I needed a job. I got a job working nights as a psych tech in a hospital. And in the early morning hours, when group therapy was starting, I got to sit down with some of these. I was like, oh my God, this is fascinating. They're asking important questions. These people want to change something about their lives. So over there. Yeah, I learned what it was. My first exposure to, like I said before, you don't know what you don't know until it's presented to you. And then I realized, wow, I could do this. I like this. And for the last 35 years, I've been working in the health field, sitting down with people as you're going through changes in their lives and asking, well, what does this mean to you? Where did it come from? What do you want to get out of it? These sorts of things. Yeah. That's what I've found I was doing all along. I was just asking myself these questions at each step of my life. Even at 7 years old, here I am in the Deep South. I'm a fish out of water. What am I doing this?
I love this sort of parallel. I equally, left religion and I'm in the mental health field now. And I find, I've never phrased this so clearly, but it's almost like these are both systems to solve the same problem. They're both systems to solve questions of belonging and meaning, for example, and just that religion is taking someone else's journey and trying to make it your own, which means it's one solution for everybody. And psychology is a, hopefully, broadly, a recognition of individual journey, like you said, is 8 billion people on 8 billion journeys, each one being its own, which unfortunately is a lot more questions and a lot more uncertainty and a lot more trial and error than somebody handing you a book that tells you how to do it. But ultimately, the reward for putting in the work is a lot more effort. And it's almost like clergy versus social, mental health professional are similar kind of thing. Is that the clergy is typically at most giving people a very narrow set of choices with which to choose and guide them with. And as a psychologist, mental health professional takes a step back and actually says, I'm just kind of here to show you some options, to ask you what you want, to support you in your journey, takes a much more passive approach in a lot of ways to allow the person to emerge instead. It's like social versus individual, and where's the power lie? I love the parallel. So it's like the inverse of each other with the same goals at the end.
Very much, because from the religious perspective, it's kind of like, know what questions you're going to ask, I'm going to tell you right now what the answers are. And, psychology, therapy, personal growth is, ask any question you want to. And the first answer you come out is probably not the full answer. It's probably going to give you another question. And that's okay too. You're right. It is the complete opposite It's very freeing, but at the same time, going back to that familiarity bias, it can be very nerve-wracking because we like to know. We like certainty. We like predictability. It's part of our evolutionary growth requires anxiety. Anxiety is that piece of the puzzle that keeps you from walking out in traffic, even when the light is green, without looking both ways. There's healthy anxiety, and there's healthy, foundations that we rely on, but they can become crutches. They're really supposed to be launch pads to the next foundation.
Yeah, I love that. It's so with this kind of perspective, what's like your words of wisdom? And I guess I have like two main demographics in mind. One is specifically, I guess, people leaving religion, coming out of that one place. And then one is a little bit more broad of everybody at the end of the day could see some amount of appeal in religion. It is solving a basic human need, right? And where do we find the alternatives to that? I know you've been speaking to this all along, but if there's any other kind of words you would say around to these two groups, which obviously have a lot of overlap.
If there's anything, so take religion off the table for a second. When I talk to clients, one of the things I want them to know is that whenever you feel alone, it's important to recognize you're never as alone as you think you are. If only because there's people, the people who feel alone on a daily basis as well. Because their journey is unique as well. They can't answer it for you and you can't answer it for them, but you can walk side by side. Put religion back on the table, understand what religion provides you with. Don't use it as a truth machine. And if you need a non-threatening way of exploring where this all comes from, like for instance, it might be too threatening for somebody for Catholic to explore Methodist theology or what have you, or Judaism or things of that nature, or Buddhism, for goodness sake. Okay, well, don't even look at another religion. Look at the work of Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth. That's pre-religion. That's a part of what we had to make sense of things because we're meaning makers, right? Before we developed the first religion, and for me personally, I think thinking outside the box, I love the work of people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, because what he's letting you know is that, you can see the world from inside of this little box, or you can pull back the blinds and you can say, wow, which in the 1820s, that's what the church did. They said, okay, we're going to lose a lot of people if we all say, okay, maybe the earth does revolve around the sun. Yeah.
Yeah. We still have our own
self-helping ideas.
Exactly. We still have the contemporary earth revolving around the sun things going on in our mind that we can look right outside and see, well, what are we finding that's different, and seeing if we can dive into that. And I think it's telling also when this is like my word of wisdom is when you attempt to do that, when you attempt to venture out of the box, what is the immediate reaction of the environment around you? Do they let you go on your own journey, or do they say, oh, that's dangerous out there, there be dragons, and that's a clue as to whether they have your best interest in mind or theirs, because they don't want you to leave, but are you serving them by sticking around, or is it really about you finding out for yourself what's going on there? And that's one of the clues, and it can be very subtle, the ways in which to try to keep you around.
Yeah. One of the things that I enjoy about psychotherapy is most of what I do is an attempt to let the client know what I'm hearing them saying about themselves.
Yeah.
And, as you get, you spend some time doing that, one of the things that they take away from that is, really? That's what you took that out of that? I hadn't thought about it that way before, Well, you brought this into this conversation. So where did that come from? It must have some significance or meaning for you. It's really interesting when you can allow someone to see their own reflection, it's a powerful experience to have that opportunity. And, religion is not going to give you that. Religion wants you to be another duplicate,
Yes. Yeah.
to be the follower, to follow all the precepts.
Exactly. I do a lot of hypnosis with people. Hypnosis goes really deep, really quickly into like motivations. And it's amazing the motivations that exist for even supposedly superficial or petty emotions, like an anger or something like that. And you're like, whoa, there's so much there for this person in their anger in this moment and what it means to them and stuff like that. And then I'm reminded of this classic Nachmanides kind of pamphlet that I was raised to like read every day. And the opening sentence is, don't be angry. Don't be angry. It's the worst trait. And that's your choice, right? Are you going to conform to a society where everyone's not angry and you know how all that plays out? Or are you going to actually go on that journey of like, what does this actually mean to me? What is my body and my psyche telling me? So I love this kind of like contrast that we had today here around like, almost like therapy versus and personal growth versus religion as almost like a choice of directions you can go. Obviously, you can walk a middle path where you take some things from religion and some things from mental health. But that argument that it's almost like a dichotomy, a spectrum of choosing one over the other, the self versus the community, with the common goal that most humans, as humans, we're aiming for. In the last minute, I like to get people, you don't have to, but if you have any questions for me, since I've been asking you a lot of questions, just giving you that chance.
So I guess what the question that I would have is, what do you find most fulfilling about where you find yourself now?
It's a great question. I think what I find most fulfilling is helping other people on their own journeys, kind of like parallel to mine. I don't think it was worth it. Some people, I think, in their trauma healing go to a place where like, oh, it's all worth it for this moment. And I'm not there and I don't know if I ever will be. But to the degree that all the stuff that I went through helps other people a little bit in their journey, that is the most meaningful to me. And that takes two main flavors in my life right now. One around specifically deconstructing religion, like me being a vocal critic of religion and mocking it and sort of like diffusing it through humor is one of my approaches. If I can be that voice of normalization to people who are thinking they're crazy or anything like that, that's huge. And then more broadly, the mental health journey, if I can bring my open-mindedness, because I try not to judge people because I've been through hell and back and I know the spectrum of what humans go through. So when somebody else comes and they've done things that they're not happy with themselves, or they find themselves in terrible places, I can see a lot of that in myself and I can try to hold space at the very least, and be like, listen, I totally get it. And with that, trying to bring that to others as well. And again, that's kind of like me bringing my own past into it. So I think the struggle when you leave religion is much harder. There is no ultimate truth anymore, and you have to make it your own. And that is a really piecemeal, evolving, continuous process. But the good news is it's your own, right? It's still the thing that is yours, and there's nothing more satisfying than is yours. I describe it as I only started making choices when I was 27, when I deconstructed it all. And it was only at that moment, I've continued to make many mistakes, but those mistakes are now mine. And I can own a mistake that I made when I made the choice. But any mistake that I made before 27 was like gun to my head. And that's the most amount of like moral injury, where kind of part of me didn't even want to, but I had to. And now I look at myself doing what I don't even want to be doing. And that is way harder to be with. So I think the meaning that we construct for ourselves is ultimately more meaningful, even if it's a much more fraught process, even though we walk through a lot more of, as the Psalm says, the valley of the shadow of death. We will have to walk through there to get to the other side, and it's hard.
Yeah.
My message to people is that it's more rewarding.
Yeah, I love the metaphor of, in order for a muscle to grow, it has to first tear.
I love that. Yeah, little micro tears that happen every time you're exercising, and that's I love that. Amazing. Thank you, Mark. It's been an awesome conversation. I appreciate your time.
Yes. Same as well. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.